The mayor's wife walked into the boutique as if the world had been designed to revolve around her. She moved with a deliberate grace, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor, catching the attention of everyone in the store, her designer dress flowing perfectly. As she looked around with a smug expression, her eyes scanning the space, as if she were the queen of the establishment, the small bell above the door chimed as she entered, and the staff froze for a moment, unsure of how to respond to the sudden presence of someone who clearly expected special treatment. Her aura of entitlement was undeniable, and it immediately created a shift in the energy of the room. She was no ordinary customer, and she knew it. Her husband was the mayor. After all, she didn't have to worry about waiting in lines or abiding by normal store rules, because in her mind her status alone gave her the right to skip the pleasantries and demand what she wanted. The boutique was known for its exclusive collections and personalized service, but it had always prided itself on treating everyone equally. It didn't matter who walked in the door, everyone received the same level of respect and attention. The staff had learned over the years that the best way to maintain their reputation was to make no exceptions regardless of who the customer was, but the mayor's wife didn't seem to care about any of that. As she approached one of the attendants, a young woman named Lucy who had only been working there for a few months, she put on a smile, but it was evident from the way the mayor's wife looked at her that it was more of a formality than a genuine attempt to be polite. "Can you bring me the latest collection right away?" the mayor's wife said, as she casually waved her hand dismissively. She didn't bother to make eye contact, and her tone was almost bored, as if she expected to be obeyed without question. The young attendant hesitated for a moment. She had been trained to assist customers, but there was something about the way the mayor's wife spoke that felt more like an order than a request, and Lucy felt a tightening in her chest. She had seen the mayor's wife around town at events, but never imagined she would encounter her in person here, and certainly not under these circumstances. "Of course, madam," Lucy replied softly, her voice faltering, as she tried to remain professional, but there was a noticeable tremor in her voice. The mayor's wife looked at her with a dismissive glance and turned her attention elsewhere, clearly uninterested in the young woman's discomfort. She moved further into the store, her heels echoing in the stillness. As she walked past the other customers who had started to notice the tension in the air, they exchanged quick glances, unsure of what was happening, but sensing that something unusual was taking place. It wasn't often that someone behaved so openly entitled, especially in a setting like this, where the atmosphere was usually calm and respectful, but this woman didn't seem to care about the usual unspoken rules of courtesy or social decorum. As Lucy scurried to fulfill the request, she couldn't help but feel a pang of frustration rising within her. She had worked hard to get this job, and she knew that she wasn't supposed to let anyone walk all over her, especially not someone who thought they could control the entire store just because of their social standing. But the mayor's wife didn't seem to care about any of that. She was already scanning the shelves for something else. She looked at a nearby rack of dresses and made a face of disinterest as she glanced over at Lucy, expecting her to keep up with her demands without a single word of appreciation. Lucy felt herself growing more and more uneasy as she moved through the store looking for the items the mayor's wife had requested, her mind racing with thoughts about how she was supposed to handle this situation. The pressure was mounting, and she knew that the longer this went on, the harder it would be to stand up for herself without making things worse. Lucy rushed to retrieve the requested collection, but with every step, she felt the weight of the mayor's wife's gaze on her back. She could feel the woman's eyes following her every move like a hawk tracking its prey. As she scoured the boutique for the latest pieces of clothing, she had to fight the urge to look over her shoulder and check if the woman was satisfied with her progress. But she didn't want to appear nervous or hesitant. She had been trained to be quick and efficient, but this felt different. This was more than just a customer with high expectations. This was someone who assumed they were entitled to special treatment just because of their position in society. Lucy picked up the first dress from the display and immediately noticed the mayor's wife wasn't looking at her at all. She was talking to another customer. This one was an older woman who smiled warmly at her, but Lucy could feel the underlying tension in the air. It was as if the room had become an invisible stage, where every move was being scrutinized under a harsh spotlight. The mayor's wife was talking as though she was the only one with anything important to say, ignoring everyone else around her and treating Lucy's presence as if she were invisible. Lucy approached her with the dress in hand, trying to steady her breathing. As she spoke, "I have the latest collection right here, madam," she said, her voice a little more confident, but still trembling with uncertainty. The mayor's wife glanced at the dress for only a moment, then waved her hand dismissively. She seemed uninterested in the item, and instead turned her attention back to the older woman in front of her, talking about a charity event she had attended last week. Lucy stood there frozen, feeling like a small figure caught in a storm, her heart pounding as she waited for some acknowledgement, something that would tell her the mayor's wife was even aware of her existence. But there was none. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours as she stood silently, trying to ignore the gnawing frustration building in her chest. Finally, with a soft sigh, the mayor's wife turned her head sharply and looked Lucy up and down. "You didn't think I came here for something so basic, did you?" she said in a tone that was meant to be a scolding but felt more like an insult. Lucy's face flushed with embarrassment. She hadn't expected this kind of treatment, not from anyone, but especially not from someone who should have known better. She had heard rumors about the mayor's wife, her condescending attitude, her belief that she could do whatever she wanted, but she never thought she would experience it firsthand. She had to swallow her pride and keep her composure or risk making the situation worse. "I'll get something more exclusive," she added, looking around the store like she was searching for something more to her liking. Lucy bit her lip as she stepped back. She knew she could find something better, but a part of her wanted to say something to challenge the mayor's wife's behavior, to let her know that her treatment wasn't acceptable. But she also knew that confrontation with someone so powerful could cause major consequences. She didn't want to risk her job or her reputation just to stand up for herself. But it didn't sit right with her that the woman's behavior was allowed to go unchallenged. She glanced over at the other customers in the store, hoping to find some sign of solidarity. But everyone kept their heads down, pretending not to notice the tension unfolding in front of them. It was clear that no one wanted to get involved. They were just trying to finish their shopping in peace, hoping the drama would pass them by. But Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to change, that this moment couldn't be ignored, and that she had to find a way to take a stand, even if it was only in the smallest way. As Lucy moved toward the back of the store to fetch something more fitting for the mayor's wife, she felt a hand gently tap her shoulder. She turned quickly, startled by the unexpected touch, to find the older woman who had been speaking to the mayor's wife standing beside her. The woman gave her a sympathetic smile, her eyes soft and understanding. Lucy could tell she was trying to offer some kind of comfort, though she wasn't sure how to respond. She had always been taught to focus on the task at hand, but now she couldn't ignore the emotions bubbling up inside her, a mix of frustration and disbelief that someone could treat her like this. Without a second thought, the older woman leaned in close enough to speak quietly so as not to draw attention. "Do you need help?" she asked, her voice kind but firm. Lucy hesitated, her mind racing for the right words, but there were none. This wasn't something she could simply explain away with pleasantries. She couldn't pretend that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. "No, thank you," Lucy replied, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't want to seem weak or overwhelmed by the situation. But at that moment she couldn't deny the tight knot forming in her stomach. She knew the mayor's wife was powerful, and that standing up to her could lead to consequences. But there was something inside her telling her this wasn't right, and she couldn't just let it go. She glanced over at the mayor's wife, who was now flipping through a rack of expensive dresses, without a care in the world, completely oblivious to the growing tension in the store. The older woman continued to watch her silently, offering no more advice, but simply standing by, as if waiting for Lucy to make her decision. The silence between them stretched on, but it was a quiet support that gave Lucy a moment of clarity. She had been raised to always respect authority and maintain a polite distance, but now she understood that sometimes respect had to be earned, not demanded. Lucy took a deep breath as she turned back toward the front of the store and began walking slowly toward the mayor's wife, who was still distracted by the clothing. She was pulling off the racks one by one, as if she were in a private fashion show. She hadn't even noticed Lucy approaching until she heard the soft shuffle of her footsteps. The mayor's wife looked up briefly and gave her a bored glance. "I'm still waiting," she said sharply, as if Lucy had forgotten her entire existence. "I'm sorry." "I'll get it right away," Lucy replied, her voice steady now, but there was an edge to it, a quiet defiance that hadn't been there before. She turned to walk back toward the fitting rooms when she suddenly felt a tap on her arm. She looked up to see the man standing there, the one who had been quietly watching everything unfold. He was tall, with a calm yet commanding presence, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were focused and sharp. He wasn't someone who would let things slide without speaking up. "You should say something," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Lucy blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected anyone to intervene, especially not someone who was a stranger. She glanced around the store at the few customers who had begun to notice the exchange, but no one seemed willing to take a stand except him. His words hung in the air like a challenge. She opened her mouth to respond, but the mayor's wife's voice cut through before she could speak. "You know this is taking too long," she said, her tone increasingly irritated. "You can't keep me waiting like this." Lucy felt her hands tremble slightly, but the man's gaze locked with hers, and he gave a subtle nod of encouragement. There was no going back now. She knew what she had to do, even if it meant risking everything. "Excuse me, madam," she said as she turned back to face the mayor's wife. "I'm afraid we do have policies in this store that apply to all customers, regardless of who they are." The words were out before she could second-guess them, and she could see the surprise flicker in the mayor's wife's eyes. For the first time, her confident smirk faltered just a little. The man beside Lucy remained silent, but she could feel his presence like a steady force behind her, encouraging her to stand tall. The mayor's wife's eyes narrowed at Lucy's words, her posture stiffening, as if she had been slapped in the face. How dare this young woman speak to her in such a way? She had expected deference, not resistance, especially not from someone who worked in a store meant to cater to her needs. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat as she caught the calm yet unwavering gaze of the man standing beside Lucy. He was still silent, but his presence was undeniable. He stood like a pillar, unmoving, steady and strong, and somehow in that moment his silent support gave Lucy a surge of courage. He had been prepared for a confrontation, but not this, not with someone so dismissive, so full of entitlement. Yet as she met the mayor's wife's gaze, she realized she wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't going to back down. The mayor's wife finally spoke, her voice cold and sharp. "Do you know who I am?" she asked, the words dripping with condescension, as if her name alone should have been enough to silence any opposition. Lucy stood her ground, no longer intimidated by the weight of the woman's arrogance. She had seen people like this before, people who thought their status made them invincible, but in this moment she wasn't going to be one of those people who let someone walk all over them just because of their position. "No, madam, I don't know who you are, but I do know that here we treat everyone equally," she said, her voice steady, now stronger than she had ever heard it before. The mayor's wife let out a scoffing laugh, as if Lucy had just told a joke. She looked around the store, as if searching for someone to validate her entitled behavior, but the other customers who had been watching quietly now shifted uncomfortably. The atmosphere in the room had changed from one of passive observation to one of quiet anticipation. It was as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The mayor's wife's eyes flicked to the man standing beside Lucy, and she sneered at him. He wasn't even trying to hide his disapproval of her behavior, and that irritated her even more. She couldn't stand being challenged, not by someone beneath her, not by anyone. "I don't know who you think you are, but I'm not going to stand here and be lectured by you," she said, her voice rising with anger. The other shoppers began to turn their attention back to the scene. As the tension grew, the man next to Lucy didn't flinch or say a word. He simply stood his ground like a quiet force of nature, and that seemed to unsettle the mayor's wife. Even more, she could see that her usual tactics weren't working on him, and that made her angry. But Lucy wasn't backing down either. The man's silent presence had given her the strength to speak up, and now she could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her, and somehow that made her feel more empowered. "I'm afraid that doesn't matter, madam," Lucy replied calmly. "You are not above the law. No one is, regardless of who they are or what position they hold." She could feel the weight of her own words hanging in the air. She had never said anything like that to anyone before, but now that she had said it, there was no taking it back. And she didn't want to take it back, not when she could feel the change in the atmosphere, not when she could sense that others were beginning to take notice of the injustice unfolding before them. The mayor's wife stood there for a moment, blinking in shock, as if she had never been spoken to like that before. She wasn't used to people standing up to her, especially not in public like this. She wasn't used to feeling vulnerable or exposed, but that was exactly what was happening. She was no longer in control, and that terrified her. The silence between them stretched on as Lucy stood firm, not backing down, even as the mayor's wife's face reddened with frustration. It was a rare sight to see someone so powerful reduced to a state of fury by words alone, but it was happening. The mayor's wife had always been the one who held the power, the one who made the rules. And now she was faced with someone who had the courage to challenge her for the first time in a long while. The mayor's wife took a deep breath, her lips tightening, as if trying to compose herself. But Lucy could see the cracks in her demeanor. The woman's bravado was starting to crumble under the weight of the truth, and Lucy felt a small sense of victory building within her. She had done it. She had stood up for herself and for what was right. The mayor's wife took a moment to collect herself, her fingers gripping the hanger in her hand tightly. As she glared at Lucy, her lips pressed into a thin line. She was angry. No one had ever dared speak to her like this, especially not in public. But she wasn't about to let this young woman get the better of her. She had dealt with people like Lucy before, people who thought they could challenge her power and influence. But she was the mayor's wife, and she would not be humiliated here, not in front of all these people. She opened her mouth to retort, but the man standing next to Lucy stepped forward, his presence calm but undeniable. He was taller than most people in the store, and his steady gaze locked onto the mayor's wife. With a quiet intensity, he didn't say a word, but his posture was enough to make the mayor's wife falter for a moment. She looked at him, as if weighing her options, trying to decide if she wanted to escalate the confrontation further. But she could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her, and it made her uneasy. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't in control. She turned her attention back to Lucy, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're really going to stand here and lecture me?" she asked, her tone biting as she looked down at the young woman, as if she were some sort of insignificant insect. "I've seen your kind before, people who think they can make a difference just because they have a few minutes of attention from others. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I'm not intimidated by you or anyone else here." She finished her words with a flick of her wrist, as if dismissing the entire situation. Lucy could see through the mayor's wife's bravado, though she could see the way her fingers trembled just slightly, and how her eyes darted around the room, searching for support that wasn't coming. The silence that followed was palpable. No one spoke, and it felt like the entire store was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Lucy stood firm, still holding the mayor's wife's gaze. She didn't flinch, didn't back away. She knew this wasn't just about the store anymore. This wasn't just about a simple confrontation. This was about standing up for something bigger than herself, something that mattered. She had always been told to respect authority and to keep her head down when dealing with difficult people. But now she understood that respect wasn't about fear or submission. It was about treating others with dignity. And that was something the mayor's wife had clearly forgotten. She wasn't going to let her walk all over everyone here, and especially not her. She took a deep breath and stepped closer to the woman, her voice unwavering. "I'm not here to intimidate you, madam, but I will stand my ground, and I will speak out when I see something wrong. I've worked here long enough to know that this store treats all customers equally, regardless of who they are or what they think they deserve. And if that means calling out disrespectful behavior, then so be it." The mayor's wife's face twisted into an expression of disbelief. She opened her mouth to say something, but the man beside Lucy spoke for the first time, his voice low and measured. "You should listen to her," he said quietly, but with authority. It was a simple statement, but the weight of it seemed to settle in the air, like a challenge. He didn't need to say more. His presence alone added an extra layer of power to Lucy's words. The mayor's wife looked between the two of them, and for a brief moment her mask of arrogance slipped. She wasn't used to being called out like this, and certainly not by someone who didn't care about her title or her social standing. It was the first time she had ever felt truly small in public, and the realization stung. She opened her mouth again, But this time her words were more measured. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the store still on her, and it made her uncomfortable. She wasn't sure how to respond to this challenge, how to restore her position of power in the room without losing face. She could see the man beside Lucy standing there unwavering, and it made her question everything she had relied on for so long. She wasn't in control anymore, and she didn't like it. She turned sharply and made her way toward the exit, her steps quick and purposeful. But as she passed by the other customers, she could feel their eyes on her, and it made her skin crawl for the first time. She wasn't the one being admired or respected. Instead, she had become the object of judgment and ridicule, and it left a bitter taste in her mouth. The mayor's wife stormed toward the door, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she marched past the other customers, her face flushed with frustration and humiliation. She was no longer the woman who commanded attention and respect. Now she was just another person trying to escape a situation she couldn't control. Her exit wasn't graceful or dignified. It was quick and filled with tension, as if she couldn't wait to get out of the store and away from the confrontation. She had just faced. Lucy watched her go, but didn't feel the satisfaction she had expected. Instead, there was a strange sense of emptiness, like the storm had passed, but left behind an unsettling calm. She had stood up for herself and for what was right, but the feeling of triumph quickly faded as the silence in the room grew heavier. The other customers were still looking around, unsure of what had just happened. No one knew whether to break the silence or pretend nothing had occurred, but it was clear the atmosphere had shifted. Something had changed, and Lucy wasn't sure what to do next. The man beside her hadn't moved since the mayor's wife left, his presence still strong and steady, as if he hadn't been affected by the drama at all. Lucy turned toward him, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but sincere. The man nodded once, acknowledging her words, but he didn't speak. He simply watched her with an expression that was difficult to read. Lucy felt a wave of uncertainty wash over her, suddenly feeling out of place, as if she had been thrust into a moment too big for her. But before she could say anything else, he turned and walked toward the exit himself. Without a word, without a glance back, he left as quietly as he had entered, and Lucy found herself standing alone in the store. Once more the tension in the air was thick, and it felt like time had slowed to a crawl. She didn't know what had come over her in that moment, but standing up to the mayor's wife had felt like the right thing to do. And somehow that knowledge settled in her chest like a heavy weight. She glanced over at the other customers who had returned to their shopping, though many of them still shot her sideways glances, as if unsure how to react to what had just unfolded. Lucy felt a little awkward, a little out of place, but as she made her way to the counter, she felt a slight sense of pride too. She had done something she never thought she could do. She had spoken up and made a stand against someone who had no right to treat others with such disdain. And in the process, she had learned something about herself, something that would stick with her for a long time. She wasn't just a passive observer. She was capable of making a difference, even in the smallest ways, and that realization made her feel stronger. As she approached the counter, the young woman who had been helping the mayor's wife earlier gave her a small smile. "Thank you for what you did," she said, her voice quiet but full of gratitude. Lucy blinked in surprise, but she felt a warm rush of appreciation for the kindness in the other woman's words. It was strange how something as simple as a thank you could change the way she felt about the entire situation. She had been so focused on standing her ground that she hadn't thought about the impact her actions might have on others. But now it seemed clear to her that the ripple effects of standing up to someone like the mayor's wife weren't just about personal victory. They were about setting a precedent that no one should be allowed to treat others with disrespect, no matter who they were or what power they thought they held. The other customers began to gather their things and make their way to the counter to check out, but the atmosphere was different now. There was a subtle shift in the air, as if people had witnessed something important, something that reminded them of their own strength and dignity. Lucy took a deep breath and smiled to herself as she prepared to leave for the day, knowing that she had done something that had made a real impact, even if it was just in that small moment, even if it was just in the eyes of a few people who had witnessed it. She had done it, and she was proud of herself for it. The next day, Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. She woke up with a renewed sense of purpose, but also with a lingering sense of unease. The events from the day before replayed in her mind over and over. She thought about the mayor's wife, and how she had tried to assert her power, how she had expected the world to bend to her will, and how Lucy had stood up to her. She didn't regret what she had done, but she couldn't ignore the way the incident had affected her. As the day wore on, Lucy tried to return to her normal routine, but it was clear that the events from the previous day had left an impression on her colleagues. They kept glancing at her as they went about their work, and some of the customers seemed to take a little longer than usual to make their purchases, as if they were waiting for something to happen, like they were unsure if the confrontation would continue to follow her. Lucy could hear snippets of whispers here and there, people wondering if the mayor's wife would come back, if there would be some kind of fallout from what had happened. But so far, there was nothing, no angry calls, no threats, no signs that anything had changed except for the fact that she was being treated differently. Her coworkers were more reserved around her, and the customers gave her wary glances. It wasn't hostility exactly, but it was a kind of distance, like people were unsure of how to treat her now. Lucy felt out of place, as if she had stepped into a new world, one where her actions had consequences. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight or being the subject of conversation, and for the first time in a long while she wished she could just disappear back into the background. As the day went on, Lucy tried to focus on her work, but it was hard to concentrate with so many eyes on her every move. She found herself wondering if she had done the right thing, or if she had made a mistake. Maybe it was better to stay silent and let people like the mayor's wife walk all over others. Maybe it was better to keep her head down and not challenge the powerful. It seemed so much easier that way. But then she remembered how it felt to stand up to the mayor's wife, how it felt to look her in the eye and refuse to be intimidated. That feeling was something she couldn't forget. It had been empowering, and in that moment she had realized that sometimes the right thing to do wasn't the easiest thing, and she wasn't going to back down now just because things had gotten uncomfortable. By the end of the day, as Lucy prepared to leave, she noticed the store was quieter than usual. The usual chatter and hustle of customers had faded, and there was a strange stillness in the air. She hadn't expected much to happen after the confrontation, but the change in the atmosphere was palpable. She had no way of knowing if the mayor's wife would come back, or if her actions would have a ripple effect beyond the store, but she couldn't help but wonder if she had started something bigger than just a single moment of defiance. Maybe the impact of standing up to someone like the mayor's wife wasn't something that could be measured immediately. Maybe it would take time for the real change to unfold. But Lucy felt something shift in her own heart. She felt a sense of pride that she hadn't felt before. She didn't need anyone else's approval to know that what she had done was right. As she walked out the door and into the evening air, Lucy took a deep breath and looked up at the sky. The cool breeze brushed against her skin, and for the first time in a long time she felt at peace with herself. She had faced something she had never expected to face, and she had emerged stronger from it. Even if no one else noticed, even if no one else saw the change within her, she knew it was there, and that knowledge was enough for now. The next morning, Lucy arrived at work early, her mind still swirling with everything that had happened the day before. As she walked into the store, she noticed a few changes already. There was a slight buzz in the air, a kind of undercurrent of energy that she hadn't felt before. As she passed by her coworkers, they greeted her a little differently, not with the awkwardness from yesterday, but with something closer to respect. It was subtle, but it was there. They weren't avoiding eye contact anymore. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement, as if they had seen something in her the day before that had shifted their perception of who she was. It was small, but it was meaningful, and Lucy couldn't help but feel a little lighter as she set her things down at her station. She wasn't sure what to expect from the day, but she knew one thing for certain: things wouldn't be the same anymore. As the morning went on, the store filled with customers, and the usual hustle of the day began to take over. But there was a new kind of energy among the staff and the customers alike. There was a buzz in the air, almost like the store had become a place where something had been ignited, like a small spark that could grow into something much bigger. People were more respectful of each other, and there was a quiet sense of solidarity among the workers that hadn't been there before. Lucy noticed it with each passing hour. She noticed how everyone seemed to be paying a little more attention to their interactions, how they took more care in their words and actions, as if the events of yesterday had made them all reflect on the way they treated each other and the people who walked into their lives, even in small ways. Lucy spent the rest of the day working with a newfound sense of purpose. She didn't feel the weight of the stairs or the whispered conversations anymore. She didn't feel out of place or uncomfortable. In fact, she felt more grounded than ever before. It was as if the act of standing up to the mayor's wife had given her a new sense of clarity, a new sense of strength that carried her through the day with a quiet confidence. She moved through her work with ease, taking on tasks with a calm focus that had been missing before. She felt more herself than she had in a long time, and that feeling of being true to who she was resonated deep within her. Later in the afternoon, just as Lucy was finishing up, a customer walked in and approached the counter. It was an older woman with a warm smile on her face. She looked familiar to Lucy, though she couldn't quite place where she had seen her before. The woman greeted Lucy with a friendly hello and asked how her day was going. Lucy smiled back and replied that it was going well. The woman seemed to pause for a moment, as if considering something before speaking again. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice kind and sincere. Lucy blinked in surprise. "Thank you for what?" she asked, a little confused. The woman's smile widened. "You probably don't realize it, but you made a big difference yesterday," she said, "and I wanted you to know that I noticed what you did, and it mattered. It was an act of courage and kindness, and it made a lot of us think. I just wanted to thank you for standing up for what's right." Lucy felt her heart swell with emotion. She hadn't expected anything like this. She hadn't known that anyone had been paying attention to what had happened, but hearing the woman's words made everything feel different. In that moment, she realized that the impact of standing up to the mayor's wife hadn't just been about her own growth or the immediate response of the people around her. It had rippled outward and affected others in ways she hadn't anticipated. Maybe the mayor's wife had left the store angry and embarrassed, but her actions had sparked something in others. It had made people think and question how they treated each other, and that was something more powerful than she had realized. The rest of the day passed in a blur as Lucy worked with a renewed sense of purpose and pride. She was no longer just someone who worked at the store. She was someone who had made a difference, someone who had taken a stand for what was right, and in doing so had changed not just herself, but the people around her. As she left for the night, the streets felt different. She felt different. She knew now that standing up for herself and for others wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic moments. It was about the small acts of courage and kindness that had the power to change everything. She walked down the street with a smile on her face, feeling more certain of who she was and who she wanted to be.